For more than 11 years, the disappearance of a young couple inside Yellowstone National Park remained one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in the country. What began as an ordinary summer hike turned into one of the strangest vanishings the park had ever seen, a case that left investigators speechless and families heartbroken. The couple had arrived early in the morning, checked in at the visitor center, and started their walk along a trail considered safe even for beginners. Nothing about their behavior suggested risk. They carried basic supplies, a camera, a map, and a lightweight backpack. Weather conditions were perfect. Visibility was clear. Other hikers saw them smiling, taking photos, and enjoying the day. Yet by the time evening rolled around, they had vanished. No footprints, no dropped equipment, no signs of distress, nothing indicating where they went or what could have happened. Park rangers searched immediately. What began as a small search operation quickly grew into a massive effort. Helicopters scanned the trees and valleys, search dogs swept the forest, and volunteers walked the trails for miles. Every possible route they could have taken was examined. Despite all efforts, there were no clues. Days stretched into weeks and the case went from confusing to unnerving. How could two people simply disappear in an area filled with hikers, rangers, and surveillance? Theories surfaced quickly. Some believed they had been attacked by wildlife, but there were no signs of blood or torn clothing. Others suspected they had wandered into a restricted area and gotten trapped. A few suggested foul play, but there was no evidence of an attacker. As time went on, the story grew colder, turning into a legend whispered by visitors and workers. People spoke about them like ghosts, as if Yellowstone's wilderness had taken them away and refused to give anything back. Their families refused to give up. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, they returned to the park, hoping for a break in the case. But the forest stayed silent. The geysers continued to erupt. The hot springs bubbled. Nothing changed, and no clues surfaced. The more time passed, the more impossible it seemed that answers would ever be found. Then, after 11 long years, Yellowstone itself revealed the truth. Late one afternoon, a team of geologists surveyed a dangerous hydrothermal area deep inside the park. This was no place for hikers. The ground was unstable, the surface thin, and boiling acidic water hid just below. Warning signs surrounded the region, making it clear that even a single step off the safe path could be fatal. During the survey, the scientists noticed something unusual. The ground had shifted in a way that was not typical. Steam vents hissed unpredictably, and the earth beneath their instruments trembled lightly. When they moved closer, they spotted objects partially buried in dried mineral buildup. At first, they assumed the items were from a recent visitor, but as they dug carefully, they realized the truth. A warped metal water bottle, a melted camera, a set of keys fused together by heat, fabric fragments preserved in hardened sediment. These items matched the descriptions of the belongings carried by the couple who vanished more than a decade earlier. The discovery triggered an immediate investigation. Forensic teams arrived along with park officials and specialists who understood the deadly nature of Yellowstone's hot springs. They all came to the same conclusion. The couple had stepped onto unstable ground, unaware that a thin crust separated them from a pool of scalding acidic water. When the ground collapsed, it would have happened silently and without warning. In seconds, they would have fallen into water hot enough to dissolve bone. This explained everything. Why search dogs never caught a scent? Why helicopters saw nothing? Why no remains were ever found? The geothermal pool had erased all evidence except for the belongings buried beneath mineral deposits. Over the years, shifting thermal activity pushed those items slowly upward until they broke through the surface again. The truth had been hidden beneath Yellowstone's dangerous landscape the entire time. Families mourned. finally receiving the closure they had begged for. The mystery that had baffled investigators for over a decade now had an explanation rooted in nature's unforgiving power. But as officials continued to study the site, they uncovered something even more disturbing, something that suggested the couple's final moments were far more unusual than anyone expected. This was only the beginning of what Yellowstone had been hiding. After investigators confirmed that the couple's belongings had surfaced from beneath the shifting ground, attention turned to a troubling question. If the area was so dangerous, how had the couple ended up there at all? The hydrothermal basin where the items were found was far from any public trail and surrounded by warning signs. Even a careless hiker would not normally wander this deep into restricted land. Something had drawn them there. When old search logs were reviewed, another confusing detail surfaced. 11 years earlier, the basin had been far more unstable, releasing constant steam that made visibility almost impossible. If the couple had fallen in, the pool would have destroyed evidence instantly. Over time, the terrain cooled, mineral deposits hardened, and the ground cracked open again, revealing what the valley had hidden for so long. But as scientists continued their analysis, unusual details began appearing, details that did not fit the picture of a simple accident. One of the most surprising discoveries was a partially melted camera memory card that still held fragments of corrupted images. Technicians managed to recover 2 distorted photos. The first showed the couple earlier on their hike, smiling near a boardwalk. In the background, behind a cloud of steam, a faint human-shaped figure stood just beyond the safety line. The image was blurry, but its posture looked deliberate, almost as if it were watching the couple. The second photo was even more unsettling. The couple appeared tense, no longer relaxed or playful. They stood near a patch of trees, and to the right of the frame, a dark, shadow-like shape blurred by movement seemed to be approaching. Investigators debated whether the shape was steam or distortion, but park rangers who knew the couple personally said their expressions told another story. Something had startled them. Geologists studying the basin also noticed something odd in the sediment layers. Certain cracks on the crust were pushed upward from below, rather than collapsing inward. This suggested that the ground had not only sunk when the couple fell, but had later shifted in unnatural ways, as if something beneath the surface had been flexing or expanding. Pressure patterns around the area didn't match typical geothermal behavior. An older ranger who had joined the first search effort came forward with a memory he had kept to himself. On the 3rd day of searching, he had found footprints near the restricted zone. 2 sets side by side walking toward the hydrothermal area, but the prints ended suddenly at a steaming patch of earth. He assumed the heat had erased the rest, so he never reported it in detail. Now, seeing the evidence surface in the same location, he regretted not speaking sooner. More clues appeared. A partially melted phone was recovered with the belongings. Most of its data was destroyed, but a single audio file remained partially intact. The recording was strange. It began with static, then a faint noise drifted through, something like a voice echoing from a distance. It repeated twice, low and stretched, before cutting off. Sound experts tried to dismiss it as vent noise, but some insisted the tone was too steady, too patterned to be natural. As these findings came together, the investigation took a more disturbing turn. It no longer looked like the couple had wandered off trail by mistake. Their belongings, the strange photos, the abrupt change in their expressions, and the odd footprints suggested they may have moved with purpose, as if they were following something, or someone. One ranger, who reviewed the evidence quietly, said something that stuck with the investigation team. They weren't running away, they were walking toward whatever was calling them. This idea unsettled everyone involved. What could have drawn them across dangerous ground, past warning signs and into a lethal area with no chance of escape? What did they hear or see that made them step off the safety of the trail? The discovery of their belongings had answered one question: how they died. But it opened the door to a far stranger mystery. Whatever had lured them into the geothermal basin had left no trace except for blurry shapes in forgotten photos and a faint echo captured in a damaged phone. And investigators were beginning to suspect that what happened to the couple was not an isolated event. After the discovery of the couple's belongings, investigators expanded their search around the hydrothermal basin, hoping for more clues. Instead, they found signs that made the case even stranger. Several trees near the restricted zone showed streaks of heat damage. Their bark darkened as if exposed to sudden blasts of steam. Yet records showed no recent thermal events in that exact location. Something had happened, but no one could explain what. A geologist then noticed a thin fracture in the ground stretching from the main trail toward the restricted basin. It looked old, but not ancient, and had likely formed around the same time the couple vanished. The crack was unusual because it didn't match the direction of normal geothermal shifts. It seemed to lead directly toward the place where the couple's belongings resurfaced. Meanwhile, analysis continued on the melted phone recovered from the site. Only one audio file was partially intact. After cleaning the static, experts heard a faint noise repeating twice. It wasn't wind or boiling water. It sounded almost like a distant voice calling out. Some dismissed it as natural resonance, but others insisted it carried a pattern too deliberate to be random. As this mysterious audio circulated among investigators, rangers began revisiting old reports from the decade of the couple's disappearance. Several hikers over the years had reported hearing strange sounds near the basin, low tones, echoing calls, and even what some described as a human voice drifting through the steam. These reports had always been brushed off as imagination or the natural roar of vents. But now, with physical evidence emerging from the same area, they could no longer be ignored. One report from 5 years after the disappearance stood out. A hiker claimed he heard a woman calling for help near the restricted zone. When he moved closer, the ground trembled and a surge of heat rose from the earth, forcing him back. Rangers investigated but found nothing. At the time, it was labeled a false alarm. Now it seemed eerily connected. Another ranger, retired now, came forward with something he had never put in writing. During the original search, he believed he saw someone standing near the basin at dawn. The figure was still, almost motionless. When he called out, steam drifted across the area, and the figure vanished. He assumed it was a heat distortion, but the image had haunted him for years. With the new discoveries, he began to doubt his earlier assumption. Investigators also returned to the corrupted photos recovered from the camera. One image clearly showed a human-shaped figure standing beyond the safety line, half hidden in the steam. The ground beneath it had been too unstable for anyone to stand on, yet the figure appeared steady and upright. Another enhanced detail showed the fog bending oddly around it, as though its presence distorted the air. Then came the most unsettling observation. In both photos, the couple appeared to be looking past the camera, not at the lens, as if distracted or watching something approaching them. Their expressions were tense, concerned, not playful or relaxed as they had been earlier in the day. As evidence accumulated, investigators quietly adopted a new theory. The couple had not wandered into the restricted zone by accident. Something had led them there, something they believed was another person, something they may have been following. This theory unsettled the entire investigative team. If the couple followed a figure into the dangerous zone, who or what was it? No other visitor had been recorded in that section of the park that day. The area was off limits, and rangers had confirmed no staff had been working near the basin. Privately, some investigators admitted what they feared. The couple might have been drawn by something they thought was a human being, but wasn't. Something that could appear in steam, stand on unstable ground, and vanish without leaving footprints. One ranger finally voiced the thought everyone else felt, but didn't want to speak aloud. What if whatever they saw has been here longer than any of us? And what if it's called to others before? The deeper the investigation went, the more Yellowstone began to feel less like a national park and more like a place with ancient secrets. Secrets buried beneath boiling pools, shifting earth, and rising steam. The couple's tragic accident explained how they died, but the growing evidence hinted at something darker behind why they ended up there. And investigators were beginning to believe the couple's disappearance was not an isolated event. Investigators continued searching the area around the hydrothermal basin, hoping to confirm that the couple's disappearance was simply a tragic accident. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the evidence became. Several trees near the restricted zone showed streaks of scorched bark, as if exposed to sudden heat. Yet there were no records of eruptions or steam bursts in that exact location. Something had happened there, but no one could explain what caused the burn marks. A geologist then discovered a narrow fracture in the ground leading from the safe trail toward the basin. It was old, but not ancient, and likely appeared around the time the couple vanished. The crack ran in a perfectly straight line, almost like a path carved through the earth. It did not match the random patterns of natural geothermal shifts. It looked directed. The melted phone recovered from the site produced only one usable audio file. After engineers removed static, a faint sound emerged. Two soft calls, as if someone in the distance were trying to get attention. The pattern was too steady to be random, but too distorted to identify. Some thought it was steam. Others believed it was a human voice. No one could agree. When investigators compared this audio with old ranger reports, the connections became harder to ignore. Over the years, hikers near the same basin had reported hearing strange sounds, echoes, distant calls, voices drifting through steam. These reports were always dismissed as imagination or wind, but now, after the discovery of the couple's belongings, they seemed like pieces of a hidden timeline. One report, filed 5 years after the couple went missing, described a man hearing a woman calling for help from inside the restricted zone. When he approached, the ground trembled, and a wave of heat forced him back. Rangers investigated but found nothing. At the time, they concluded it was a misunderstanding. Now it felt eerily connected to the couple's fate. A retired ranger also stepped forward with a secret he had kept for more than a decade. During the original search, he believed he saw someone standing still near the basin at sunrise. He called out, but the figure dissolved into steam. When he reached the area, the ground was too unstable for a human to stand on. He had blamed the vision on exhaustion. Now, he wasn't so sure. The corrupted photos recovered from the couple's camera only made the case stranger. One picture showed a human-shaped figure standing beyond the safety line, half hidden in mist. The ground beneath it should have collapsed, yet the figure appeared stable. In another photo, the couple looked tense, staring past the camera at something approaching them. Their expressions suggested fear, not confusion. All these clues led investigators to a chilling possibility. The couple may not have wandered into danger on their own. They may have been following something they believed was a person, something that appeared human, but wasn't. This theory disturbed everyone involved. No other visitors were recorded in the area. No ranger was working near the basin. The figure in the photos had no clear features, only a dark outline shaped like a person. The deeper the investigation went, the more Yellowstone felt less like a national park and more like a place with its own ancient presence. a place where steam, heat, and shifting earth could create illusions strong enough to mislead even experienced hikers. By now, investigators agreed on one fact. The couple had been drawn off the trail. Whether by a voice, a shape, or something else entirely, they walked toward something they could not understand. Whatever it was, it led them into the most dangerous stretch of land in the park, a place where the earth hides its victims beneath boiling pools and silent steam. And investigators suspected this mysterious presence had been active long before the couple arrived. In the weeks that followed, investigators continued piecing together every detail from the discovery site. The more they studied Yellowstone's hidden basins, the more they realized that the couple's disappearance might not be an isolated incident. Unexplained vanishings had occurred in the park before, some dating back decades, each case ending the same way. No evidence, no remains, no answers. One pattern stood out. Nearly all of these missing hikers were last seen near geothermal areas. Some of them were dismissed as tragic accidents, but the similarities were striking. No animal tracks, no signs of struggle, and no physical remains ever recovered. Investigators began compiling a list of cases, mapping them on a digital terrain model. When the points were connected, they formed a rough arc stretching across Yellowstone's most unstable volcanic zones. The couple's disappearance fell exactly in the center of that arc. Digging deeper, a specialist discovered something chilling buried in historical archives. In the early 1900s, before the park had modern restrictions, several explorers had documented strange sounds near geyser fields, sounds described as voices in the steam or shadows walking in fog. Back then, these accounts were dismissed as folklore or frontier superstition. But now, with the newly uncovered evidence, those old descriptions no longer sounded like stories. They sounded like warnings. As the investigation intensified, one ranger suggested reviewing satellite data from the week the couple vanished. Much of the old imagery was low resolution, but one thermal scan revealed a brief spike in heat directly beneath the basin. It lasted only seconds, just long enough to register. The burst aligned with the estimated time the couple fell. What puzzled scientists was the shape of the thermal signature. It was narrow, tall, and upright, not a typical burst of steam. It resembled a human-sized silhouette. When the image was enhanced, the outline became even more distinct. Something hot had been standing near the basin at the moment the ground collapsed. But no ranger was in that area, no tourist had permission to enter, and no equipment registered movement except the heat spike. This discovery only deepened the mystery. If something stood near the basin that day, why had no footprints been found? The ground should have recorded impressions even briefly. Yet once again investigators saw nothing but untouched earth and thin, fragile crust. Inside the investigation center, tension grew. Some officials wanted to close the case entirely and leave the new discoveries unmentioned. Others argued that the missing hikers across Yellowstone deserved answers. But every time the team tried to explain their findings, they ran into the same problem. Nothing fit standard scientific explanations. Park officials decided to reinforce restricted areas, adding more warning signs and digital sensors. But those who had followed the investigation knew this was not enough. The danger wasn't simply unstable ground or hot water. Something else was hidden in the steam, something unpredictable, something that seemed to mimic human form. One late evening, while the team reviewed photos, a technician noticed a detail that no one had seen before. In the couple's final recovered picture, the shadowed figure near the steam wasn't just standing still. Its head was slightly tilted, as if listening, and the direction it faced was not toward the couple, but toward the camera. The fog around it seemed to swirl inward, forming a faint spiral pattern. The technician enhanced the image again. The spiral intensified. It looked like heat being pulled inward toward the figure, or like the figure itself was generating heat, drawing the fog toward its center. This discovery sent a ripple of fear through the room. Rangers who had searched the area long ago suddenly remembered the overwhelming sense of being watched, even when they knew they were alone. One ranger admitted he had felt a presence in the steam that day, but he never spoke about it because he couldn't explain why. With these unsettling clues piling up, investigators started to wonder if the geothermal basin was more than a natural hazard. Maybe it was also a kind of lure. Maybe the strange sounds and vague shapes in the fog were not coincidences or hallucinations. Maybe they were signals. The couple's tragic fall now appeared to be the result of following something they believed was a person in distress. But what they had actually followed remained unknown, hidden behind mist, heat, and silence. One investigator summed up the growing fear in the room. Something out there knows how to appear human, and it knows how to hide behind the steam. The team realized their work was no longer just about solving a disappearance. It was about understanding what else Yellowstone might be concealing, and whether anyone else had been drawn to the same unseen presence. As investigators continued studying the basin, they found something beneath the surface that changed the direction of the entire case. A seismic scan revealed a hollow chamber under the ground, connected to several thin cracks stretching toward the trail. The chamber was unusual because its temperature rose and fell in a steady rhythm, unlike normal geothermal activity. The pattern looked almost like slow breathing. Scientists tried to explain it as shifting gases, but the fluctuations were too controlled. Even more unnerving, the chamber reacted when people walked near the surface. Each time footsteps approached, the temperature inside rose slightly, as if something below sensed the movement. This discovery forced investigators to consider how the couple might have been drawn off the trail. If they heard a voice, it could have been sound echoing from the chamber. But that didn't explain the figure in the photos, the heat signature recorded from above, or why the fog seemed to curl around a shape that should not have existed. To understand the anomaly better, investigators compared the couple's photos with older visitor images taken near the same region. Surprisingly, a few photos showed faint human-like shapes in the steam, barely noticeable unless enhanced. None were clear, but they were similar enough to raise suspicion. These shapes only appeared during periods of unstable ground or shifting heat. Then another clue surfaced. A retired biologist had once reported sensing a heat shape near a vent, but dismissed it as exhaustion. His notes said he felt watched, though no one was near him. At the time, the report was ignored. Now it seemed significant. Investigators began to consider a new theory. Maybe Yellowstone's steam and heat could form temporary illusions, shapes that resembled people. In certain conditions, these shapes might even seem to move or signal, especially to someone already alert. To an unsuspecting hiker, such a shape could easily look like a human being in distress. And if the couple believed someone needed help, they would naturally leave the trail. But something still troubled investigators. The couple's footprints had never been found leading into the restricted area. Even unstable ground usually leaves some trace. Yet the earth showed nothing, as though the prints were erased. A geologist suggested extreme heat might have softened the crust, removing evidence. But another expert pointed out that other missing persons cases in similar conditions still had faint tracks or disturbed soil. Only this site was completely clean. This led to an unsettling possibility. The basin may have shifted, heated, and cooled in a way that erased the couple's path, but preserved their belongings. It acted almost deliberately, hiding some things and revealing others. Investigators realized the couple did not simply walk into danger. They followed something, whether an illusion, a sound, or a shape formed by steam, into one of the deadliest places in the park. One ranger said quietly, Yellowstone didn't just take them, it guided them. The team started to believe Yellowstone's geothermal heart might create conditions that mimic life, conditions powerful enough to mislead even experienced hikers. The couple's tragic end now appeared to be part of a much bigger pattern, and investigators feared others may have been drawn in the same way. After weeks of investigation, a pattern emerged that left the team uneasy. Every explanation based purely on nature failed to account for one crucial detail: the couple's clear decision to walk toward the restricted basin. People do not wander into lethal terrain unless they believe they are going toward something important, something urgent, something human. Investigators returned to the recovered audio and noticed a peculiarity. The faint call-like sound repeated at a frequency close to the pitch of a human voice. Not identical, but close enough to be mistaken, especially from a distance. Sound engineers proposed that the geothermal chamber acted as a natural amplifier, turning echoing vents into tones that resembled speech. But even they admitted the pattern was too precise to be random. This made investigators revisit the retired ranger's story about seeing a figure during the original search. They brought him back to the site. Standing near the basin, he pointed to a section of ground where he'd seen the silhouette. When the team checked the ground's history, they found that the exact spot had been stable for only a brief period, just long enough for someone, or something, to stand there if conditions were right. Then came another disturbing clue. Satellite thermal imaging from the week the couple vanished showed subtle footprints of heat leading from the main trail toward the basin. They weren't human tracks. They were heat signatures, faint pathways where temperatures shifted slightly higher than the ground around them. They moved in a straight line, fading near the collapse zone. Scientists tried to explain it as geological activity, but the shape was too narrow, too linear, too intentional. It looked like a path of warmth leading them forward. Investigators now faced a chilling possibility. Yellowstone's geothermal system could be producing more than steam. It might be creating heat forms, moving pockets of warmth that could resemble human silhouettes in fog or trick hikers into thinking someone was ahead of them. If the couple had seen a warm, human-like shape through the mist, their instinct would have been to follow it. The couple's final photo supported this idea. The shadowy figure behind them did not cast a normal shadow. Instead, the fog bent around it, as though being pulled inward. This was exactly what hot rising air does. Heat pulls moisture toward it, forming a swirling pattern. The figure had no face because it was not a person. It was a column of heat shaped vaguely like one. But this theory raised a darker question. How did these heat forms appear at the right time in the right place and move in ways that seemed intentional? Was it coincidence, or did Yellowstone's shifting underground pressure create timed pulses that mimicked movement? And if these illusions were forming for decades, could they be responsible for past disappearances as well? To test the theory, investigators performed an experiment at dawn. They placed thermal cameras, steam sensors, and motion detectors around the basin. As the ground warmed, faint shapes began forming naturally, mist pillars twisting upward, fog narrowing into columns, rising and drifting like living silhouettes. Then something unexpected happened. One of the fog pillars paused. It didn't rise or drift like the others. It remained still for several seconds as if anchored to a single spot. The air shimmered around it. The heat signature intensified. The shape stretched slightly taller, thinner, almost like a person standing at the edge of the mist. Every camera captured it. Then, as quickly as it formed, the figure dissolved back into the fog. The investigators stared at the footage in silence. It was not a ghost or a creature. It was not alive. But it behaved in a way that did not match natural patterns. Something within Yellowstone's geothermal system, a mix of heat, pressure, shifting chambers, and mineral steam, was creating illusions that could move, pause, and appear human. The couple, on that tragic day, had not followed a person. They had followed a mirage shaped by the land itself. What none of the investigators could answer was why the phenomenon seemed to repeat in patterns connected to disappearances. One ranger said what everyone was thinking. Maybe Yellowstone doesn't hide people, maybe it calls them. After capturing the drifting heat figure on camera, investigators felt torn between relief and dread. They finally had visual proof of a naturally formed illusion, a shape created by rising heat and thick fog. But the way it behaved lingered in their minds. Natural fog pillars don't stop. They don't hover. They don't stretch into forms eerily similar to the human silhouette captured in the couple's last photo. Still, the team proceeded with caution. They began mapping the times when these heat figures appeared. Surprisingly, the formations occurred most often in the early morning and late afternoon, precisely when lighting conditions make it hardest to differentiate people from shadows. The couple's last verified movements matched this time frame almost perfectly. Investigators now believed they knew how the couple reached the restricted basin. They likely saw one of these heat-formed silhouettes appearing between the trees, mistaken it for a real person, and followed it deeper into the unstable region. Yet something still troubled the team. The shapes usually formed near vents, not along the trail, and they didn't move in straight paths. But the heat signatures from satellite images clearly showed a narrow line of warmth leading directly toward the collapse site. Too straight and deliberate to be random. This wasn't just an illusion, it almost looked like a path. A geologist proposed a theory. The underground chamber discovered earlier might release bursts of hot air through cracks that temporarily form above it. As the heated air escaped, it could create a moving wave, guiding vapor in a consistent direction. To someone on the surface, especially from a distance, this could resemble a figure walking. If that's what the couple saw, then their final actions were understandable. They believed they were following another hiker, maybe someone lost or injured, unaware that the shape wasn't a person at all. Still, there were more unanswered questions. One particularly troubling detail surfaced when another ranger reviewed old geothermal data. The day the couple disappeared, sensors recorded a sudden pressure drop, brief but significant. This shift would have sent a powerful wave of hot air upward, potentially forming the strongest heat illusion the park had ever seen. The couple may have witnessed the most convincing version of the phenomenon, one detailed enough to resemble a real human silhouette. But why did this event happen so precisely when the couple was nearby? Pure coincidence? Or something else? Investigators decided to interview the man who had reported hearing a woman's voice 5 years after the couple vanished. His testimony now seemed more relevant than ever. He described the voice as echoing through steam, soft but unmistakably human. When asked if it sounded like words, he hesitated before answering. "Not words exactly," he said, "but it felt like someone was trying to get my attention." He also noted that once he stepped closer, the heat surge nearly knocked him back. That surge happened in the same region where the chamber's pressure had been fluctuating unpredictably. If the underground system could produce human-like sounds and human-shaped heat forms, it could easily mislead people into believing someone needed help. The team began to see a startling picture forming. Yellowstone wasn't haunted. It wasn't hiding creatures or strange entities. Instead, the geothermal environment itself, heat, pressure, water, steam, and shifting chambers, might be creating illusions so convincing that people mistake them for real humans. But another question arose. Why did these illusions always seem to occur near areas known for disappearances? An investigator suggested a chilling possibility. Maybe people disappeared because they were most likely to follow these illusions. A moving shape, a cry for help, a silhouette in the fog. These would lure even the most cautious person forward. Now, with the couple's case partially solved, investigators recognized a bigger danger. More hikers could fall victim to the same phenomenon unless the park issued stricter warnings. That evening, the team met privately. No cameras, no official notes, just a candid discussion. Several rangers admitted they had experienced odd sensations in the basin, feeling watched, hearing faint calls, or seeing blurred shapes move in the fog. None had reported it before, afraid of ridicule. Now, those experiences felt like clues. One ranger said softly, "It's like the land knows how to copy us, not perfectly, but just enough." But the room fell silent. They all understood the implication. Yellowstone's geothermal heart wasn't alive, but it behaved like something ancient and unpredictable, capable of creating illusions that mimicked humanity. The couple had not been the first to follow these shapes, and investigators feared they would not be the last. With each new discovery, the investigation pushed deeper into questions no one had ever asked before. If Yellowstone could create illusions that resembled humans, how long had this been happening? How many missing persons cases over the decades could be connected to the same phenomenon? And most unsettling of all, was the geothermal system becoming more active, more unpredictable, or more capable of producing these shapes? To look for answers, investigators examined old ranger logs, stretching back more than 60 years. What they found was startling. Although written decades apart, many entries described the same strange experiences: unidentifiable voices drifting near vents, silhouettes appearing in steam, sudden heat surges that came without warning. Some rangers even confessed they had ignored these details because they sounded too strange to report officially. One ranger's note from 1983 described a figure made of fog standing near a geyser field at dawn. Another entry from 1996 mentioned hearing a man's voice call for help, only for the ranger to find no one within miles. These logs, which had once seemed like odd, isolated events, now looked like evidence of a long-standing geothermal illusion phenomenon. The deeper investigators dug, the more consistent the pattern became. The illusions were most common in areas where the ground was thin and unstable, where underground chambers created complex echoes and heat pulses. When conditions aligned, temperature, pressure, steam, and sunlight, the environment could create shapes that looked uncannily human. Most visitors ignored them or mistook them for regular hikers. But those who paid too much attention, those who followed the shapes too closely, sometimes ended up walking into unstable ground. And then they vanished. The couple's case was tragic, but it revealed something crucial. The geothermal system didn't intend harm. It wasn't alive or malicious, but its illusions were convincing enough to lead people into lethal zones without warning. Investigators decided to recreate the conditions of the couple's final moments. At dawn, they placed heat sensors and fog generators near the basin, while monitoring the ground's temperature. As the sun rose and cold air met the warm steam, the fog thickened. Suddenly, the thermal cameras picked up the formation of a tall, thin column of heat standing a short distance away. To the naked eye, it looked like a person standing still. To the thermal camera, it was a pillar of rising air. Then, in front of the team, the shape began to drift. It moved slowly, steadily, almost like it was walking, but no footsteps formed beneath it. The ground was untouched. The air simply shifted, guiding the fog pillar forward. Watching it, the rangers felt a chill. If they had seen that from 30 meters away, they would have believed it was a hiker. It was painfully clear how the couple had been misled. But another discovery made the case even darker. When investigators reviewed long-term geothermal data, they noticed a spike in underground pressure on the exact morning the couple disappeared. That spike matched with the largest heat illusion the team had ever recorded. It wasn't random. It was a powerful release that created a hyper-realistic silhouette, one strong enough to seem alive. The couple likely saw this shape moving slowly into the basin and believed someone needed help. Following it felt natural, logical, human. They couldn't have known the ground beneath the illusion was deadly. As investigators processed their findings, a heavy silence settled over the team. Answers had finally begun to form, but they came with a sense of horror. The geothermal basin had unintentionally created a perfect trap. Illusions that mimicked people, echoes that mimicked voices, and ground so unstable that a single step meant certain death. Before closing the day's session, one ranger asked the question that hovered over everyone's mind. If this has been happening for decades, how many others followed these shapes, and how many more will? It was a question no one wanted to answer, but everyone understood. Yellowstone did not kill out of malice, but it created conditions so deceptive that people could be lured unknowingly into danger. The couple's tragic fate was no longer a mystery. It was a warning. The discovery of Yellowstone's heat illusions changed everything about the investigation. What had once been viewed as isolated tragedies now formed a chilling pattern spanning decades. The deeper the investigators looked, the more they realized that countless hikers might have followed the same deceptive shapes into danger, never knowing they were walking toward the most unstable terrain in the park. After documenting the drifting pillar of heat that looked like a human figure, the investigation team decided to analyze the basin at night. They hoped cooler temperatures would reduce visibility and allow them to observe the phenomenon without sunlight interfering. As darkness settled over Yellowstone, the team took their positions around the perimeter, each equipped with thermal cameras and motion sensors. At first, nothing happened. The geysers hissed softly, vents released thin coils of steam, and the ground remained quiet. Then around midnight, a motion sensor picked up movement near a shallow vent. A mist column rose slowly, twisting as it warmed. As it grew taller, it thickened, taking a shape disturbingly similar to someone standing with their back turned. It wasn't alive, but for a moment it gave the illusion of a person silently watching the basin. Suddenly, the shape flickered and shifted sideways. The movement was subtle, but enough to mimic the swaying motion of a walking figure. The team watched in disbelief as the silhouette glided across the fog, leaving no trace on the ground. It paused again near the drop-off where the couple had fallen. Then it collapsed into steam and disappeared. The team reviewed the footage immediately. The shape had no mass and no physical outline. It was made entirely of heat and vapor, but from a distance, especially in low light, it looked exactly like a person. This raised a frightening realization. The couple might not have just followed a single illusion. They could have followed a sequence of shifting shapes, each one forming near a vent, drifting forward, dissolving and reforming farther ahead. To human eyes, especially in panic or confusion, this would look like a person moving ahead of them, leading them deeper into danger. Investigators expanded their research to include all missing person cases recorded in geothermal areas. They found more disturbing overlaps. Each disappearance happened during times when geothermal pressure was unusually high. Each occurred near unstable ground, and many were during seasons when cool air met warm steam, the perfect recipe for heat illusions. It was no coincidence. One investigator compiled these incidents into a detailed map, linking pressure spikes, steam activity, and missing hikers. When he presented the map to the team, the room went silent. The pattern wasn't random. It circled Yellowstone's most reactive geothermal zones like an invisible ring. For decades, people had been unknowingly walking into illusions created by nature itself. But there was still one final unanswered question. Why did the illusions appear to move so intentionally? Why did they drift in straight lines, pause, or seem to look back at hikers? Natural steam pillars should rise or disperse, not mimic human behavior. A physicist proposed an idea that unsettled even the most skeptical members of the team. The underground chamber might release bursts of hot gas in waves. These waves traveled through cracks in the ground, pushing heat upward along specific paths. Depending on timing and weather conditions, these waves could create the impression of a walking figure. Another investigator pointed out that the fissures and cracks beneath the basin formed linear pathways that matched the movement of the illusions. It was possible that the geothermal system was behaving like a complex machine, one capable of producing repetitive patterns, including ones that looked like motion. This theory made sense scientifically, but emotionally, it left the team uneasy. Yellowstone's geothermal heart, though not alive, behaved with eerie predictability. It created illusions so lifelike that they appeared purposeful. Late that night, one ranger whispered what everyone feared. If people can mistake those shapes for real humans, then no warning sign will ever be enough. The investigation team realized they weren't just solving a mystery anymore. They were uncovering a hidden danger that had existed in the park long before modern visitors ever walked its trails. And unless the world understood what Yellowstone could create, more people would be drawn toward those silent, shifting forms in the steam. The investigation moved into its most delicate phase. Officials understood that Yellowstone's illusions were dangerous, yet revealing the full truth to the public could cause panic. Most tourists saw the park as a place of beauty, not a landscape capable of creating human-shaped mirages strong enough to lure people into deadly terrain. Still, the team needed more proof before deciding how to proceed. One morning, investigators conducted another controlled test. This time, they introduced artificial temperature changes using portable heaters and cooling panels to simulate shifting ground conditions. Within minutes, steam across the basin began to distort. A pillar of fog thickened, curved, and stretched upward. Then another formed beside it, this one taller, narrower, and strangely still. The two shapes hovered close together like silent figures. The second one tilted slightly, imitating a posture eerily similar to the shadow captured in the couple's last known photo. A ranger watching through binoculars whispered, "If I didn't know better, I'd think that was a person." The shapes held for nearly 20 seconds before dissolving into the air. Although the phenomenon was natural, its realism was undeniable. The experiment proved that geothermal conditions could produce multiple illusions at once, walking, drifting, or standing still like human silhouettes. But this revelation raised another disturbing question. What if two people had followed two different illusions at the same time? This possibility explained why the couple walked deeper into the restricted area without hesitation. They may have seen more than one figure, moving or standing ahead of them. In their minds, this could have been a group of hikers or a family in trouble. They might have felt responsible to help. Still, the investigation team remained worried about one final detail. The couple's camera captured a figure standing unnaturally still, not drifting like steam normally does. It appeared solid, anchored, almost deliberate. To explore this, investigators examined the basin's airflow patterns. They realized that certain cracks in the ground released heat in steady bursts, not rising but flowing horizontally just above the surface. When these air currents hit cooler pockets, they caused fog to consolidate into stable shapes that could remain motionless long enough to resemble a standing person. It was nature crafting illusions with eerie precision. But there was something else. A small notebook found near the basin, presumably dropped by a ranger years earlier, contained a sketch. The drawing showed a tall, thin silhouette standing near a vent. Under the sketch, the ranger had scribbled a short line. "Saw this again today. Not human." The ranger never submitted this report officially. He later admitted he was afraid of being ridiculed. This old sketch matched the figure in the couple's photo almost perfectly. The team now believed the geothermal illusions had fooled more than just one or two people. They had appeared repeatedly over decades, always near dangerous zones, always during pressure shifts, and always during times of cool weather. These illusions weren't new. Yellowstone had been forming them long before anyone realized their deadly potential. Toward the end of their study, investigators placed long-term thermal cameras aimed directly into the basin. Over several nights, they recorded hundreds of hours of footage. Nearly every morning just before sunrise, faint shapes formed in the fog. Some were brief, others lingered. One, recorded on the final day of monitoring, moved in a straight line from one vent to another before dissolving. It looked disturbingly like a person walking. Watching the footage, a senior investigator finally said what no one wanted to voice. "This isn't supernatural, but it's dangerous. Very dangerous. And if people don't know what these illusions are, they'll follow them. Just like the couple did." The truth was now undeniable. Yellowstone's geothermal landscape didn't just hide danger beneath the ground, it projected danger above it. Shapes that resembled life, movements that mimicked people, signals that seemed like cries for help. And unless something changed, those illusions would continue forming long after the investigation ended. With undeniable footage of the geothermal illusions, investigators began preparing their final report. But the deeper they reviewed the evidence, the more unsettling the story became. Yellowstone wasn't just forming shapes by accident, it was creating illusions powerful enough to mimic human behavior. Illusions that had misled people for generations. The team now needed to determine how to warn the public without sparking fear or harming tourism. Yellowstone received millions of visitors each year, many drawn by the very geothermal features that produced the illusions. Revealing everything openly could create panic. But saying nothing meant more hikers might unknowingly follow these heat-formed shapes into lethal zones. As the team debated their options, another piece of evidence surfaced. A hydrologist studying water flow beneath the basin discovered that shifts in underground pressure caused sudden bursts of steam that traveled through cracks like pulses. These pulses created rhythmic vibrations that echoed through nearby vents. When the vibrations reached the surface, they formed low-toned hums and echoes, sounds that, under the right conditions, resembled distant voices. This discovery explained the couple's audio recording, the hikers who thought they heard cries for help, and even the ranger who believed he heard someone calling in the early morning fog. Yellowstone wasn't speaking, but its underground system created illusions of sound just as easily as illusions of shape. The basin wasn't haunted. It was a natural illusion engine. Once the final tests were completed, investigators gathered in a briefing room to assemble their findings. Hours were spent reviewing photos, audio recordings, temperature logs, satellite data, and old park reports. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. The couple had followed a geothermal illusion formed by rare, but repeatable, environmental conditions. Still, no one could forget one chilling detail. The illusions didn't just form randomly. They tended to appear along the same invisible paths, the same vents, and the same cracks in the earth. These pathways created the impression of movement, leading people deeper into unstable terrain. In the couple's case, these illusions led them directly into danger. One ranger asked the question hanging heavily in the air. How many others saw these shapes but ignored them? And how many followed them and never came back? The room fell silent. Later that evening, the investigation team hiked to the basin one final time to gather remaining equipment. The steam curled in thick layers, illuminated faintly by moonlight. The ground rumbled softly beneath their feet. As they packed away the last thermal camera, one of the investigators paused, staring across the basin. For a moment, a faint shape stood in the fog, tall, still, and silent. He blinked, and it was gone. He didn't mention it to the others. Instead, he helped gather the last of the gear and left the restricted area behind. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shape had been watching them, and not because it was alive, but because the conditions of the land made it appear so convincingly human. Back at headquarters, the team finalized their internal report. It included maps of dangerous zones, diagrams of illusion pathways, and recommendations to strengthen barriers and warnings. The official explanation for the couple's death remained simple. They accidentally entered a hazardous geothermal area. But the private report, kept only among investigators, outlined the full truth. Yellowstone formed illusions of heat and fog that mimicked human voices and human shapes. These illusions could move, pause, and even appear to watch. They were powerful enough to mislead even experienced hikers, guiding them into deadly terrain. The couple had not been careless. They had not been reckless. They had been misled by nature itself. And as long as Yellowstone continued to breathe through its hidden chambers, those illusions would form again. Once the internal report was completed, Yellowstone officials faced a difficult decision. Should they quietly adjust park policies or release everything to the public? Some argued that visitors deserved to know the truth. Others feared that exposing the illusion phenomenon would damage tourism and spark fear-driven rumors that would spread faster than the facts. As debates continued, investigators were instructed to perform one final week of observation. Their goal was to confirm whether the geothermal illusions appeared consistently or only during rare conditions. The team returned to the basin before sunrise, when the steam was thickest and temperatures were cold enough to create the strongest effects. The atmosphere that morning was unnervingly quiet. The geysers hissed, the ground simmered beneath thin crust, and a pale mist hovered low over the earth. The investigators placed sensors along the same path the couple likely walked years earlier. Then they waited. At first, everything remained calm. But as the sun began to rise, the ground's temperature shifted ever so slightly. A soft rumble echoed beneath their feet. Steam rose in thicker plumes. One of the sensors flashed, signaling a small burst of heat beneath the ground. And then it happened again. A shape began to form in the mist. This time, it appeared closer than ever, only 20 feet from where the investigators stood. It rose slowly, taking on a tall, slim outline, like a person standing perfectly still with their arms at their sides. The fog curved around the shape, bending inward just as it did in the couple's photograph. The figure held its form for several seconds before drifting sideways, gliding across unstable ground. One ranger instinctively stepped forward, forgetting for a moment what the shape truly was. Another ranger grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "That's how it starts," he whispered. The shape continued drifting until it reached the edge of a narrow crack in the earth. There it paused and seemed to waver as though waiting. Then, as the temperature shifted again, it vanished into the rising steam. The team documented everything, but witnessing the illusion so close left them shaken. Even knowing it wasn't alive, the sight of it triggered instinctive reactions: concern, curiosity, the urge to follow. It was exactly what the couple must have felt on that tragic day, and exactly why this illusion was so dangerous. After the shape disappeared, investigators moved to the far edge of the basin. They were careful to stay on safe ground. From this vantage point, they could see the vast geothermal heart of Yellowstone. Steam rising, vents hissing, the land shifting in slow, hidden movements. It looked calm, yet alive, restless, yet quiet. As they observed, one investigator spoke softly. "This place doesn't need monsters or ghosts. The land itself creates the lure," and the others nodded. Later that afternoon, while reviewing thermal footage, they noticed something else. The heat signatures for the illusions followed nearly identical pathways every morning, curving, stopping, forming, and drifting along the same lines in the earth. These lines matched old fissures and new cracks, forming what looked like a patterned route through the basin. It wasn't random at all. Yellowstone's underground pathways were guiding the illusions like channels, shaping them into forms that appeared human. No wonder the couple felt like they were following someone. One investigator compared the pathways to long, invisible rails carrying heat along predictable routes. When the team overlaid these lines on maps of previous disappearances, their suspicion was confirmed. Nearly every vanished hiker from past decades had last been seen near one of these geothermal paths. The illusions weren't chasing people. People were unknowingly walking along the same routes the illusions followed. The couple had simply been the latest victims of a natural phenomenon that looked, sounded, and moved convincingly enough to imitate human presence. With the evidence overwhelming, investigators prepared to present their findings to park leadership. But many worried that the truth might be too difficult for the public to accept. The land didn't kill them on purpose, but the land didn't warn them either. Yellowstone had quietly formed illusions for decades, and until policies changed, it would continue forming them long after the investigation ended. With the illusion pathways mapped and the evidence confirmed, the investigation shifted toward creating new safety protocols. But the officials soon realized something troubling. The geothermal illusions did not appear in fixed locations. They shifted over time, following new cracks as they formed and old fissures as they changed shape. This meant that even if the park closed off certain areas, new danger zones could emerge anywhere the underground pressure changed. One geothermal expert described it simply: "The land is moving. The danger moves with it." This made the park's next steps painfully complicated. Yellowstone covered thousands of square miles, and geothermal conditions could shift without warning. Blocking all potential illusion routes would mean closing large sections of the park, an impossible task. Despite the challenges, investigators continued gathering data. One evening, they set up thermal cameras along a ridge overlooking the basin. As darkness fell, they watched steam rolling across the ground like waves. When the temperature dropped suddenly, the first illusion formed. This one was different. It rose slowly from a vent, much larger than any they had seen before. It took the shape of a wide, towering figure, broader than a human with shoulders that seemed to sag. The fog folded inward, creating an outline so detailed that one investigator whispered, "No wonder people mistake these things for real." The shape swayed gently, then bent forward, as if peering toward the investigators on the ridge. The cameras captured the moment clearly. Though the figure had no face, no eyes, and no features, its posture suggested attention, curiosity, or something that resembled awareness. Then the shape collapsed, dissolving into the night air. The team reviewed the footage repeatedly. The size of the formation wasn't just unsettling, it hinted at another problem. As geothermal pressure changed, the illusions could become larger, more defined, and more convincing. The couple had followed a smaller illusion, likely during a minor pressure event. But if the park experienced a larger shift, The illusions could become even harder to distinguish from human figures. Later that night, investigators gathered for a private conversation. They knew they were standing at a crossroads. They could recommend major closures and new warnings, but would visitors even believe that mist and heat could form human-like shapes? Would the public take it seriously or dismiss it as myth? To get clarity, they interviewed several longtime park employees. Some had stories they had kept to themselves for years. One ranger admitted that as a new recruit, he once followed what he thought was another ranger into a thick fog bank, only to realize the figure had no footsteps and no sound. He stopped just before the ground gave way beneath him. Another park worker described hearing what she thought was a child calling near the geysers during winter. When she approached, the sound faded into steam. She found no tracks in the snow. These confessions added weight to the investigators' fears. The illusions were so convincing that even trained rangers had nearly been misled. If the most experienced people in the park could be fooled, ordinary hikers had almost no chance. Near the end of the investigation, the team decided to revisit the couple's original trail. They walked the same route the couple had taken on their final day. The forest was quiet, the wind gentle. To a normal visitor, nothing looked dangerous. The trail felt peaceful, serene, even inviting. But when they reached the point where the couple had likely first seen the illusion, the air shifted. A subtle warmth drifted through the trees, rising from a narrow crack in the earth. The investigators immediately recognized the sensation. It was the same subtle heat flow that created the drifting shapes in the basin. One investigator closed his eyes and imagined walking there without knowing the danger. A faint shape moving ahead, a sound echoing in the distance, the belief that another person needed help. It all made perfect sense. Anyone with empathy would follow. And that was the tragedy. The couple died not because they were careless, but because they cared. They followed what they thought was a lost hiker. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed someone needed them. In the end, they were victims of the land's illusions, false signals created by a natural world that did not understand the danger it projected. The investigators walked silently back to their vehicles, each of them carrying the same heavy realization. Yellowstone was breathtaking. Yellowstone was ancient. Yellowstone was powerful. And Yellowstone was capable of creating illusions so convincing that even the best of people could be pulled into its depths. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the team focused on understanding one final piece of the puzzle: the psychological impact of Yellowstone's illusions. Why did people trust the shape so easily? Why did they follow them without hesitation? The answers, they realized, had more to do with human instinct than with mystery. When people see a figure standing still in the fog, their minds naturally fill in the missing details: eyes, a face, a reason for being there. When they hear a faint call echo across the steam, they automatically assume it came from another person. Yellowstone's illusions didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to be close enough to trigger empathy, concern, and the human desire to help. To test this theory, investigators conducted a controlled experiment with volunteers who did not know the purpose of the study. They showed participants blurred images captured from the geothermal basin, dark shapes, fog pillars, and vague silhouettes. Even without context, most participants said the shapes looked human. Some described them as a man standing alone or someone trying to get attention. The results were unanimous. Humans were wired to recognize human form, even when none existed. This realization helped explain why the couple's final moments unfolded the way they did. They were young, empathetic, and responsible. When they saw the shape appearing and disappearing through the fog, they assumed someone was in trouble. When they heard faint echoing tones, they interpreted them as calls for help. Their instincts guided them forward. But nature had created a deadly illusion. After weeks of compiling data, the investigators finally prepared a draft of the public report. It explained that the couple died after accidentally entering a dangerous geothermal area. It mentioned unstable ground and shifting heat patterns, but avoided the deeper truth about illusions. The team knew the public wouldn't understand the full story, and many tourists would dismiss it as superstition or exaggeration. The private internal report, however, told everything. It contained hundreds of pages of maps, charts, thermal images, audio analysis, and video footage, proof that Yellowstone could unknowingly create human-like shapes, echoing sounds, and moving illusions capable of misleading even trained rangers. Just as the team began preparing to file the final documents, another unexpected detail surfaced. A firefighter who assisted in a search years earlier contacted the investigators after hearing about the new discoveries. He revealed that during his search, he found a pair of footprints near a geothermal field, not from the couple's case but from a different missing hiker. The footprints walked straight toward a vent, then stopped abruptly. There were no drag marks, no signs of slipping, nothing. Just a clean end, as if the person had vanished into the air. At the time, he assumed the ground had swallowed the tracks. But now, with everything he had learned, he believed the missing hiker had followed an illusion, just like the couple did. This testimony confirmed the investigators' greatest fear. Multiple disappearances across Yellowstone likely had the same cause. And they had gone unnoticed simply because the park's geothermal activity was so complex that the truth stayed hidden beneath steam and minerals. The final days of the investigation were filled with quiet tension. A few park officials struggled with the idea that Yellowstone's beauty hid something so dangerous. Others accepted it with somber resignation. Nature had never promised safety, only wonder. Before closing the case, the team visited the basin one last time. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow across the land. Steam drifted upward in slow waves, curling through the trees and across the vents. Then, as if on cue, a small shape formed in the mist. It was faint, only a thin column rising from the ground, but for a moment it resembled a person walking away. The investigators stood still, watching it drift toward the far edge of the basin before dissolving completely. No words were spoken. They all understood what they had been fighting to explain. Yellowstone didn't create monsters. It didn't summon spirits. It didn't mean to lure anyone. It simply created illusions. Illusions so hauntingly human that they could lead a caring person to their death. And that was terrifying enough. Once the investigation team completed their final visit to the basin, the atmosphere among them changed. They no longer felt like scientists solving a mystery. They felt like witnesses to something ancient, powerful, and indifferent. Yellowstone wasn't just a landscape. It was a shifting system capable of shaping illusions that looked, sounded, and moved like human beings. And no amount of equipment or warnings could fully predict when or where these illusions might appear again. Back at headquarters, officials gathered for one last closed-door meeting. The investigators presented their findings with measured voices, showing thermal recordings, fog silhouettes, and audio samples. Park directors listened with growing unease. What they saw wasn't supernatural, but it was deeply unsettling. They recognized immediately that this information, if released without context, could easily be misunderstood by the public and distorted into rumors about spirits or creatures. So a decision was made. The full internal report would be sealed, accessible only to a limited number of park officials. The public would receive a simplified explanation. The couple accidentally entered unstable geothermal terrain and were lost due to extreme heat. Additional warning signs and barriers would be installed, and rangers would undergo new training to recognize early signs of illusion formation, shifts in air temperature, unusual fog movements, and echo patterns. But the truth about the illusions, the heat shapes, and the echoing voices would remain off the public record. After the meeting, investigators returned to their routines, but none of them saw Yellowstone the same way again. They felt a quiet weight, knowing that the land they walked on could project human-like shapes with uncanny detail. They had seen how easy it was to mistake a heat form for a living soul, and how quickly compassion could lead someone off the safe trail. One investigator, assigned to file equipment logs, paused by the window overlooking the steaming horizon. He watched fog drift across the valley and imagined how many times those shapes had formed unnoticed. How many visitors had caught glimpses of human-like figures and shrugged them off, and how many hikers, long before GPS existed, had followed these illusions into the depths of the wilderness, never to return. Later that week, a ranger hiking alone near another geothermal area radioed in a strange report. He claimed he saw a figure standing at the edge of a vent, still, silent, and gray. When he called out, the figure dissolved instantly. The ranger didn't approach. Instead, he backed away, choosing safety over curiosity. The investigators reviewed his description. The shape matched their previous findings exactly. The illusions were not limited to one basin. They existed across the entire geothermal network. As days passed, small changes began appearing throughout the park. More signs were added along trails, warning visitors to stay on marked paths. Rangers increased patrols near high-risk zones. New thermal monitoring systems were installed underground. These measures would reduce the danger, but none of them could eliminate the illusions entirely. Yellowstone's geothermal heart was too vast, too ancient, and too unpredictable. Near the end of the season, the family of the couple returned to the park. They were guided to a quiet overlook far from dangerous ground. There, an investigator explained gently what could be shared, that the couple likely mistook natural steam formations for other hikers. The explanation was simple, but the family understood the meaning behind the investigator's tone. Something had misled their loved ones, something beyond human control. They placed flowers at the overlook, whispered goodbyes, and watched the steam rise in soft, twisting shapes. As the sun set, one flower petal lifted in the warm air, spiraling upward into the drifting fog. For a long moment, the mist folded and curved, forming something almost like a reaching hand. Then the shape fell apart and floated away. The investigator watching from behind felt a chill. It was a reminder that Yellowstone's illusions were still forming, still shifting, still capable of deception. The story of the couple's disappearance had finally been solved, but the force behind their final steps would continue long after the case was closed. Not alive, not malicious, just a natural phenomenon powerful enough to mimic the human form. And that, in the end, was the most haunting truth of all. As months passed, Yellowstone returned to its familiar rhythm. Tourists walked boardwalks, cameras clicked, and geysers erupted like nothing had ever changed. But the rangers who had witnessed the investigation knew better. Beneath the calm surface, the geothermal heart of Yellowstone still shifted, breathed, and created illusions that looked disturbingly human. Those who had read the confidential report patrolled the trails with new caution. They watched how fog moved, how steam twisted, and how shadows seemed to stand still in the rising mist. Winter made the illusions stronger, as cold air trapped heat in tall, drifting shapes. Most visitors never noticed them. Those who did thought the figures were tricks of light. But rangers knew these shapes could lure someone off the path if they appeared convincing enough. One evening, a ranger saw a faint silhouette near a vent, tall and motionless. When he called out, The figure dissolved instantly into a swirl of fog. The ranger didn't approach. He simply watched, reminded of the couple who had once followed an illusion to their deaths. Across the park, investigators monitored pressure changes underground. New cracks formed while old ones sealed, creating shifting routes where illusions might appear again. When a family of a long-missing hiker wrote asking if the new findings helped explain their loss, investigators answered gently. The truth was painful, but clear. Yellowstone produced illusions that looked and sounded human. These illusions were unintentional, but powerful enough to mislead good people into dangerous terrain. As seasons changed, more rangers reported seeing shapes forming in steam. Figures that stood, drifted, or seemed to watch before fading away. None were alive, yet each looked real enough to trigger instinct. On a late patrol, 2 rangers saw a perfect silhouette rise from the fog. For a moment, it appeared to walk. The younger ranger reached for his radio, but the older one stopped him. "This is why people disappear," he said quietly. Yellowstone didn't create monsters. It didn't summon ghosts. It created illusions, echoes of heat and mist that could fool even the most cautious hiker. The couple who vanished years earlier hadn't made a mistake. They had followed something that looked human. They believed they were helping someone. Their compassion had led them into danger shaped by nature itself.